Human sufferings anywhere concerns men and women everywhere. This quote by Elie Wiesel perfectly encompasses our obligation to address the tragedies of history.
The infamous Holocaust took place in the 1940s. Adolf Hitler, the communist leader of Germany, wanted to create a purified nation. He executed his idea of a sanctified Germany by putting anyone who wasn't the standard of perfection, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans, into concentration camps. These camps were mainly filled with Jews because Hitler had a personal hatred of them for their part in the Versailles Treaty. Adolf Hitler created labor camps to house and exterminate those he viewed as less than human. His soldiers rounded up these undesirables and forced them to ride in cattle cars, where they had no room to sit down and no food to eat or water to drink. They arrived at concentration camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau and Dachau. Here they received barely enough food to allow them to work, maybe even a crust of moldy bread or soup with molded vegetables in it. Those who couldn't work were either executed on the spot or sent to suffer an agonizing death in one of the many gas chambers. Their bodies were then burned in a crematorium. The inmates allowed to live were forced to sleep in barracks that were freezing and packed full of people with various contagious infections and illnesses. Those who could not work due to sickness would either be sent to die or sent to a medical doctor to be experimented on.
Because Hitler's goal was to create a purified nation, he sifted through the people that came through the concentration camps and took advantage of those who had a specific anatomy, like twins. The Nazi doctors experimented daily on twins and people who were already going to die because they were suffering from diseases. They would make their subjects endure makeshift conditions to see how their body would react, simulating the potentially deadly simulations that German soldiers would face in war.
For instance, they would put the victims through freezing temperatures and experiment on the fastest way to heat their body without killing them, mirroring when a German pilot evacuated into the North Sea from his plane. They would also reduce their brain's exposure to oxygen to see how much it could withstand, seeking to find how high of altitudes the brain could endure, simulating how high a German pilot could go while retaining consciousness. They even injected various diseases and infections into different places on the body and studied how quickly infections became deadly. They had no regard for the value of life.
Joseph Mengele was one of the most infamous Nazi doctors. He is known as the Angel of Death, who experimented on twins, usually children. He studied their anatomy and genes to try to replicate the process. He wanted a way to create more of the standard German. He studied everything about twins, down to their eye color. Whether their subject died or suffered, physically or emotionally, was irrelevant. All they cared about, how it could benefit the Third Reich.
The majority of experiments done were to attempt to invoke mass sterilization or ways to benefit the German soldiers' rates of survival. Nazi doctors conducted torturous tests on the inmates of Dachau concentration camp, seeking an answer to hypothermia. The goal in mind, to discover the best way to save pilots who had fallen from their planes into the North Sea, Dr. Sigmund Rascher would drop inmates dressed in pilot gear into freezing cold water to study how long their bodies could withstand the temperatures and the most rapid and effective way to heat their bodies up. Through this mortifying experiment, Rascher discovered valuable data that medical scientists and doctors use today. We now have extensive knowledge on the bodies and how temperature and duration affect hypothermia.
Another example is the advancements made to acknowledge dehydration produced by Dr. Hans Ebinger. He visited the concentration camp Dachau to conduct experiments to study how the body reacts to drinking seawater for long periods of time. He would separate a group of inmates and starve them with fresh water, forcing them to become deathly dehydrated. We now know that dehydration-related death mirrors high-speed kidney failure.
Many experiments consisted of Nazi doctors injecting their subjects with infections to see the most effective way to treat them. They would mutilate the inmates' bodies by shoving dirt and glass into open wounds, studying how long it took them to grow infectious. Tests like these often resulted in death or lasting disabilities for the survivors.
As you can see, these mortifying medical trials have revealed medical knowledge that we may not have been able to discover without these heartless doctors. There is no rationalization for the actions done to the defenseless inmates of the Holocaust. Nevertheless, the data they obtained has been foundational to medicines and cures that we now have. The medical data acquired through the Holocaust has created a massive controversy of ethics throughout the times. After the war ended, scientists and doctors deemed the sterilization procedures unscientific. But they could not ignore that the advancements made in the knowledge of human anatomy, the data required on hypothermia, and bodies' exposure to extreme deathly simulations was too valuable to ignore. Because of this, not only is the Holocaust itself a major turning point in history, but also a significant contributor to modern-day medicine.
As we look back on history, there are circumstances such as the Holocaust where we are ashamed of the actions of mankind. It evokes questions of morals, ethics, and even a conscience. We may tend to look back and focus only on the unthinkable actions of the doctors, but we cannot fail to remember the lives that suffered at their hands. The horrific Nazi medical experimentation that was conducted in the Holocaust has undoubtedly shaped modern medicine. The many victims of the Holocaust have unwillingly created a turning point in history. Their sacrifice has evolved man's knowledge of medicine and human anatomy significantly, making the tragic event of the Holocaust and the medical experiments performed a major key in the foundation of modern medicine.